Hey Untold Radio Network fans, want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Well, good evening, all my fellow weirdos and weirdettes. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I've had a heck of a busy week. For those of you with any interest in the things I do other than this and film festivals, which I talk about, I've also been working on a feature documentary called The Man Who Invented Flying Saucers about Raymond A. Palmer, about the Shaver mystery, and about the creation of modern UFO belief. And I recently, because that documentary is still probably a year away, I recently took a segment from it and worked it into a standalone story about the Shaver mystery, which anybody who watches regularly knows is one of my favorite things to talk about. And so I've started submitting it to festivals. So that's super exciting. I'll obviously, when and if it gets into any festivals, I'll always tell you. So if you're ever in an area, perhaps where it's screening and there's a festival near you, you'll be able to go and check that out. Now, speaking of that documentary, one of the main, I suppose, experts or talking heads in the documentary is one of my guests tonight. And he's been fascinated, or actually he's my only guest tonight. So he is my guest tonight. And he's been fascinated by the unexplained for over half a century. There were 2 major events that inspired his interest in the unexplained. Growing up in Michigan, the March 1966 UFO flap occurred virtually in his backyard. The following November, a winged humanoid chased 2 couples down a lonely country road near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the legend of the Mothman was born. Tonight's guest would be chasing the Mothman the rest of his life. Influenced primarily by Keel and Jacques Vallee, his views on UFOs became unconventional and moved toward a more paranormal explanation. His main area of research is what some call high strangeness or window areas, which is a term that Keel dubbed those places where all kinds of disparate types of paranormal phenomena all seem to occur in the same location. And he believes that studying these paranormally active locations may well be the key to understanding the origin of the manifestations themselves. He has his own podcast called The High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and is a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files, which can be found on the same network. He currently lives in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, how cool, and works at the Mothman Museum. He is also writing a book, as yet untitled, that deals with the underlying patterns that connect different types of paranormal phenomena throughout history. So I'm delighted to welcome back to Talking Weird my good friend and one of the people I enjoy talking to more than anybody else on the planet, Steve Ward.
Thanks for having me back, Dean. Real pleasure.
It's so great to have you. And I was lucky enough to guest on your show just the other day. So people can go and find that on the Paranormal UK Network now, the High Strangeness Factor that I was on.
And we were on with Susie Bastille. She was my guest co-host, and she has been on your show also.
Yeah, she was the guest last week when we were talking about the Pukwudgie, and I forgot to show them again. My daughter last week put them even in a bag for me, to show, because when she saw the art I made for the Pukwudgie episode, and I had to explain what a Pukwudgie was, she said, it sounds like calico critters to me. And she ran away and got these little animals she has of all these different animal families, and one are hedgehogs. And sure enough, they're kind of anthropomorphic. So they do indeed look a little bit like very friendly Pukwudgies. I promised her I'd show it, and I forgot to. But tonight we're going to be changing it up a little bit, and we're going to be talking about one of the things which is so prominent in the writings of John Keel. While so many ufologists of the period that he was writing were concentrating on the nuts and bolts type of apparitions of silver discs supposedly from outer space landing on the planet, he was often more interested in the experiences of what we would call what was called contactees, people who supposedly had direct physical and or mental communication with the alleged entities from the crafts themselves. So maybe you could jump off and tell people a little bit about that phenomenon and how Keel approached it.
Of course, people mostly know his book, The Mothman Prophecies. Well, a lot of people, they know something about the Mothman, this 6 to 7 foot tall creature, humanoid, 10-foot wingspan, red glowing eyes. And they know that he chased cars and scared the heck out of some people. But a lot of people don't know about the prophecies part of the Mothman Prophecies. And John Keel was... in this particular year, that 66 to 67, that he was immersed in all this. He had made 5 different trips down to Point Pleasant. You know, he had heard about the what he thought of as the Garuda, this winged Garuda, sort of something out of Hindu mythology. And at first, he actually thought it was just a large bird. So he jokes about it in the Mothman Prophecies that he oiled up his 14-foot monster traps and headed to Point Pleasant. But then before long, in talking to people and so forth, he found something much stranger was going on. And there were all kinds of things happening in the Ohio Valley. Well, one of them was, and over time, and not just the Ohio Valley, he was in contact with a lot of people in Long Island, in New York, where a lot of this phenomena was going on. It almost seemed like it congregated around him. And he used this term, silent contactees. Now, we usually use the term contactee separate from abductee, and an abductee is the guy that's taken away by the Greys with the unscheduled medical exam. I mean, the only advantage is there's no deductible, you know. But the other aspect of it is that the contactees go back to the 1950s, when there were a lot of people that were claiming that they had contact with Venusians from outer space. That George Adamski claimed he met a Venusian in the California desert. There's a whole, Daniel Fry, Orfeo Angelucci, and so forth, and they weren't really taken very seriously. But that the contactee was separate from the abductee. Now, to add to the confusion a little bit, often John Keel would use the term contactee to mean both back when he wrote his books. But the thing is about these particular contactees, these people that Keel was interviewing and actually friends with and talking to, firmly believed that they were having some kind of contact with some other intelligence. And at times they seemed to suggest that they were meeting these entities face to face. Other times it seemed more like we're dealing with channeling or something like that. But they were silent contactees because they had absolutely no drive to tell the press or people. They went about their business. They would get their messages. Sometimes they would receive prophecies. And the thing that would kind of lure them in was some of these prophecies would come true. Plane crashes or whatever, things that would turn up in the news that would be something that was prophesied. But as time went on, sometimes Keel found that these contactees, silent contactees, were given strange quests to perform. He talked about a crucifix that was supposed to be hidden somewhere in Brooklyn. And if you look at some other writings of Keel, supposedly if one found it, it was going to be something very beneficial for mankind. But so they would sometimes they would get these crazy, never-ending quests that didn't mean anything. But then other times it was like the who was the famous Lowhead, I believe. He was a professor at University of Michigan some years ago, and he was in contact with a woman that believed she was in contact with other entities. She was channeling this information, and the world was going to end on December 15th or something like that. So they had gotten several predictions that were legitimate, and then the December 15th one was, okay, get your friends together, get on the hill. The Space Brothers are going to pick you up, the believers. And so he told everybody. And of course, the Space Brothers didn't show, and eventually he lost his job. So that's, Keel was very concerned. He called this false illumination. I mean, there are people throughout history that have had various forms of illumination. They've had visions and so forth. Some of them seem to be positive, but for so many of the silent contactees, it seemed like there was something very negative, some undercurrent underneath. The trickster, for example.
It's interesting, certainly, people being told an event's going to happen in various religions throughout history, and even other famous UFO contact cases. For example, the individual, I forget her real name, but her name in the academic study is Marian Keech, in When Prophecy Fails. She was a housewife who essentially led a UFO group who said a great flood was coming and the ET people were going to evacuate. And then they didn't evacuate. And that's a similar story to the one that you just said then. And when that failed to happen, we in many ways started to have our academic understanding of cognitive dissonance. When somebody has a belief system which is threatened by a fact, you would imagine that the fact would make you throw the belief system overboard. But what the academic study in the Marian Keech trial showed was that many of the believers double down in their belief system. And you see similar things in Heaven's Gate, and you see similar things in the Unarius Academy of Science and all these other UFO groups that set some kind of prophecy that's going to come. And when it doesn't occur, while a few members might walk, what happens is a lot of the hardcore members, same as a lot of contactees, they don't necessarily throw their belief overboard. The cognitive dissonance from the fact clashing with the belief makes them just double down more on their belief and find more excuses and reasons why the Space Brothers didn't come at the hour that they said they would.
It was about one of the things that helped me put this together was it was about 1980. The TV set was on, and you know how you're not really paying attention, but then something grabs you. It was one of the old Phil Donahue shows, way back before his hair turned white and before he started using a lot of gimmicks and so forth. But he had a parapsychologist on, and I tried to find out who this guy was. He was tall, dark hair, had kind of an Eastern accent, American Eastern accent. But he was talking about automatic writing. And what he was saying was, he said, now, it's perfectly all right if you want to practice this, but be aware. Most of this, although he believes some of it was coming from elsewhere, he said most of this is coming from your own subconscious, but it will talk to you like it's something else. And he said it'll go through 3 stages. First, it'll be friendly, and then it will become personal, and then sometimes it gets to be nasty and attacking. And he said that it could be something you could use for therapy. I don't know why he said that. I don't want to use automatic writing that's saying nasty things about me for therapy. I think maybe I'll go to a regular shrink. I don't know. But it was very, very interesting when he went through those stages. And I'd been a student of Keel for a while. I thought that sounds like what some of these silent contactees have gone through. And, if you look at Alexandria David Neal. She wrote Magic and Mystery in Tibet about 1911, I think it came out. Supposedly she lived with the Tibetans, and supposedly she learned how to create a tulpa from them, a thought form. And if the story's true, she focused on this entity, a jolly little llama. And I don't mean the animal, I mean the way, the sage, the seer or whatever. And she created this plump little llama that only she could see, and it would show up once in a while. And after a while, it started to change a bit. It started to play pranks on her friends, like almost like a poltergeist. It's when she looked at it, its appearance started to change. It became leaner and thinner, and it had kind of a mean look on its face. And it got to the point where it was kind of nasty and attacking people. Again, if the story is true, well, then she claimed that she had to turn around and actually dismantle or destroy this thing with her mind, with her thoughts. Okay, again, who knows if this is true or not? But again, you have an illustration of this three-stage, friendly, intimate, and then something turning kind of nasty. And that seems to me, that may suggest that Keel was onto something when he saw, he talked about the way that this phenomena was seemed to be connected to human consciousness to some degree, that we may even co-create some of this stuff. Paranormal mimicry, the reflective factor, because of the way you and I have talked before about the way the progression of the UFO phenomenon has changed throughout the years, from the airships to the Foo Fighters to the classic science fiction, UFO saucer. And so there's several. There's even a couple other things that I ran into. There's a fascinating book by Joe Fisher called Hungry Ghosts, and it's worth another read. I read a reference to it from Colin Wilson. I mean, Colin Wilson was he gave us so much. He's got his writings are just phenomenal.
Absolutely.
But he refers to this book called Hungry Ghosts, and in it, Joe Fisher he's a journalist. He's a writer, and he gets in contact with several different mediums, and he starts to have sessions with them, and these entities, these supposedly spirits of the dead, are talking to him, and one is supposed to be this woman that he is supposed to have been tied with through various reincarnations that originally was from Greece. And he finds, and this is, really putting the story short, but he finds he's kind of falling in love with this woman and believing that this all happened, that they really had this connection. And he's also talking to other people that claim that they were shot down in World War II and so forth. So he went on a quest. He wanted to prove this was true. And he went on a quest. He actually went to England. He went to Greece to trace all this down. And he found some of the information was dead on, was absolutely correct. And some of it was absolute nonsense. There were just huge gaps. So when he would come back and he talked to these entities through the medium, they would give him a lot of double talk. They would blame him. It was just bizarre. And he was really, it was almost like he was losing his mind for a while. And there was a friend of his that was also involved in this group, where it's almost like they were trying to lead him to suicide. I say whatever this energy, these entities, or the trickster, whatever it is. And so, again, we have these patterns that keep showing up in all these different aspects, where that suggests that there's something, I can't help but think of the classic science fiction film, the Forbidden Planet. Remember the MacGuffin? The monsters from the id. For those that don't know, they discovered this ancient race that left this incredible technology behind. Nobody knows why they disappeared, but they had these machines, this device that could create consciousness into matter, thoughts into things. And what happened was they forgot about monsters from the id, the dark part of the subconscious, or maybe the trickster, I don't know. And eventually they were destroyed by that. And of course, the principal characters in the film are almost overcome by that also. But monsters from the id is a great concept.
It's interesting that people who have looked at all levels of the paranormal. Not everybody, of course, but like the book you were talking about, Hungry Ghosts, certainly Keel was aware of it. Jacques Vallee is particularly aware of it. I mean, when you look at Messengers of Deception and his other works. Emanuel Swedenborg, the great spiritualist of the 18th century, or wherever it was back in the day, G.K. Chesterton, the list goes on and on and on, that people are aware that whatever these non-human intelligences are, whether it's ourselves, like you said, maybe just something in our own subconscious talking to us, or whether it is a genuine external intelligence which is independent to some degree of us, they always seem to tell us lies. They always, and that doesn't mean there isn't some truth in there, because any good liar is going to not say every single thing as a lie. They're going to weave the deception in with the lie, the same way a good disinformation campaign run by an intelligence agency is going to intertwine the truth with lies, because then it's much harder to determine where the lie hits. But it's interesting that again and again, these things seem to tell us lies.
And there's a couple of books that have been printed, the Big Breakthrough and the Big Blackout, and it's material taken from who's the gentleman that runs johnkeel.com? Doug Skinner. Doug Skinner has created, a great website. He has collected all kinds of material, including some of Keel's private writings, and some of his private writings are in these two books. The Big Breakthrough and the Big Blackout. And some of it repeats the stuff, the parallels, the stuff that was going on in the Mothman prophecies. And remember the lady named Jay, he calls her Jay Perro, who is supposed to have had all these contacts with Men in Black and Mr. Apple, APOL, sort of an Indrid Cold type character. When you read these books, you're getting into Keel's head more than the Mothman prophecies. He's wondering, is she putting me on? Is she making this up? But there's things that she can't possibly know without this really happening. But the thing is, in these two books, you find Keel gets completely pulled in to this these entities, this channeling, whatever the actual source is. Not just Jay Perro, but several other people are receiving these messages, and this is all leading up to the Silver Bridge collapse and the deception of this, what they said was going to be some kind of an EM effect on December 15th, when it wasn't that at all. It was just another trick, another deception. But he really, and Keel admitted, I remember hearing him on Art Bell's show when the film The Mothman Prophecies came out. And he said that he admitted how paranoid he had become. And he said that one of the things he really liked about the film was it captured that paranoia that he felt.
Does. And I think Jacques Vallee mentions that in one of his Forbidden Science volumes, which are essentially Vallee's journals, when he's actually keeping track of Keel corresponding with him back in that time period. He's like, Keel's losing his mind. Like he's sliding down this paranoid kind of slope.
Well, even Ivan Sanderson and his wife mentioned how he was kind of going off the deep. But, he had, just as an aside, he had a lot of stuff going on. If you read the Mothman Prophecies, he had... the IRS was after him. His phones were being tapped, and it turns out that in one of the collections of his articles, there is an interview. I'm not sure if it's the Don Ecker one from UFO magazine or not, but Keel, and I never knew this, Keel talks about how he had written a critical article about J. Edgar Hoover, and this is back when J. Edgar Hoover was in power. 2 weeks later, he was receiving a bunch of this harassment. So a lot of the stuff going on in the Mothman Prophecies wasn't paranormal. It wasn't Indrid Cold or Mr. Apple. It was the bloody FBI. But here's sort of a postscript to that. When you read, now the Mothman Prophecies was, they cut out half of it, they altered it. They changed a few things. Anyway, he salvaged about 2/3 of it in the Eighth Tower, which is essentially a sequel to the Mothman Prophecies and something that he would have liked to have included in the Mothman Prophecies. He says in there at one point, I can't quote it verbatim, but he said he's embarrassed when he was out in the woods and out, talking to these entities through channelers and so forth, and accepting what they were saying essentially. And so he so during the big breakthrough and the big blackout, that was this period where they had him hooked. And he was really concerned that a lot of these things were really going on, and there seemed to be different factions of groups fighting each other and everything. It was quite a 3-act play, and very deceptive. But so he by the 8th tower, he had wised up and realized wherever the source is, and it's interesting because he wasn't sure that all these experiences were physical. And he even suggested that some of the Men in Black encounters might have been illusory, not hallucinations. They were some kind of an outside source or influence, but they weren't physically real. And that would explain a lot, because some of those experiences are just off the charts bizarre.
I think in one of Keel's books, and I can't remember which, he hypothesizes and wonders if maybe if we actually were to look at a contactee when they were going under an experience, they would just be standing stock still with glazed eyes staring at the heavens, or words to that extent. Like, maybe this is something, as you said, maybe it is an internal experience more than an external experience. Maybe they go into some kind of fugue state when they're interacting with the anomalous. Maybe that's very common. Maybe all kinds of people who are interacting with all kinds of paranormal phenomena actually do enter a different state when this occurs. Certainly people like Patrick Harper would suggest that, and Henry Corbin, the Islamicist who wrote about, or the Islamic scholar who wrote about the imaginal world, which in many ways demonic, Patrick Harper's work in the demonic realm is kind of riffing off the idea that this might be another state which people are entering. They mightn't be totally in the physical world when they're having these experiences.
Well, of course, the story of Anne Jeffreys in the 1600s, she reported these detailed encounters with the little people, with the fairies, and firmly believed them. But the problem is she never left her room when she was having these experiences. And of course, we know from Jacques Vallee's Passport to Magonia and other researchers that there is a very interesting link between many traditions of folklore and at least some modern day UFO experiences.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, Richard Shaver, who both you and I have a particular interest in, his experiences in the caverns all took place when he was actually institutionalized. So it also makes you wonder how much is internal and how much is external. Now, we have a great question from Horace Smith, who's the Emeritus Professor of Astronomy and Physics at Michigan State University and a good friend of the show and a regular guest on the show. He asks, is the behavior of the entities the same for Western and non-Western societies? If they were people's subconscious, then effects might vary with societal mindset. What's your thoughts on that, Steve?
I think generally that they are the same, but I think it was Jacques Vallee that pointed out that when we talked about the close encounters of the third kind, the landings and the entities, South America, France, and the U.S., how there did seem to be some differences in the way these entities appeared. In France, they were kind of, silver-suited, laid-back, kind of calm observers, nothing exciting going on. In South America, there were a lot of like vicious attacks, creatures with claws and so forth. And in the U.S., some of them were a little bit more like a science fiction movie, like the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins. So I haven't really pursued that too much, but there might be something to that. And Vallee was suggesting that culturally, some of these things are very, very different. But I think when you get down deep, the underlying connection, you will get the same kind of patterns from all over. The voices spoken to people from the woods, that luring them into the woods. So many people have awakened or whatever, or they get some kind of an urge to go to a particular place. So they have an encounter that's called pixie led in other cultures. That there may be some differences on the surface in connection to some of the different cultures, but I think basically we're talking about the same kind of experience.
Yeah, I was on Josh Turner's show with Jason McLean on Saturday night, and some of this type of stuff came up. And I made a point, and I think it's worth reiterating here because obviously not everybody was watching that show in response to Horace's question, is that I think we often, and I'm sure you'll agree, Stephen, tell me if you don't, I think we often get as people who are interested in the paranormal, we often get lost or trapped looking at the type of facade that mightn't matter. Like we might get more concerned about what an entity looks like, or where an entity says it comes from, rather than looking at the actual experiences. So I think, to Horace's point, there might be an entity in the Middle East might supposedly have a different origin and say different things and look different to an entity in Ireland, for example. But if you look at the actual behavior of both them and our own interactions with these other things, often those things, I think, transcend cultures. And I also think it transcends the phenomenon. So, for example, as Joshua Kitchen and Timothy Renner talk about in Where the Footprints End, if somebody in the woods gets a pebble or a stone thrown at them and don't see what the entity is throwing at them, they assume it's a Sasquatch, right? Particularly if they're believers in, Bigfoot lore. But if it's an investigator or somebody who thinks their house is haunted and pebbles get thrown at the house or dropped on the roof, they assume it's poltergeist activity. So you can have very similar aspects or very similar phenomena manifest within what traditionally we parcel off into either cryptozoology, or we parcel off into fairy faith, or we parcel off into specter hunting, or we parcel off into UFO belief. But often these things behave, if you strip away the outside, if you pay attention to how they smell or how we interact with them or the actual things they do, it seems to be that there's something underlying all of these experiences which might have a very common root source.
There was in one of the Bigfoot books I read, can't recall the one exact one, but he talks about I think it was in the 1970s in Cadillac, Michigan. There are two boys, and they're seeing a Bigfoot by a tree, just kind of moving around or whatever. They think they can't be seen, so they watch this for a little while, and later on when they go home, they find they're missing 2 hours. So missing time is only supposed to occur with UFOs, but there are other cases where people have had missing time and connected with Bigfoot. And remember when John Keel, when he first arrived in Point Pleasant, I think it was Mrs. DeWeese gathered together a lot of the original witnesses, and so they were all at her house. That's when he met Connie Carpenter. Connie Carpenter had conjunctivitis. She had eye burn, and she had not seen a UFO, which is the classic explanation. If somebody sees a strange light or a strange craft, sometimes they receive conjunctivitis. It was the Mothman. She saw this thing by the Mason County Golf Course. Keel said that he found that people, whether they experienced a cryptid experience or a UFO experience, a lot of times they suffered this the same physical effects. Sometimes conjunctivitis, thirst, eye burn, and so forth, suggesting, as he said, he got to the point where he wasn't concerned anymore about how many windows the UFO had, or even what the creature looked like. He wanted to understand the cosmic mechanism behind these things. And, the suggestion that, the idea that people were having these same physical effects with different types of phenomena suggests that there is some kind of a link there, and he was probably onto something.
Now, then that's fascinating. Now, to change things a little bit, but to stay within the in the realm of contactees and some of the stranger aspects of this encounter. I was, as I mentioned to you, I think before the show started, I was flicking through Keel's Operation Trojan Horse, which is my favorite. I said Mothman's probably my favorite book. It's probably everybody's, but I think it's his most important book. It's kind of his magnum opus on UFOs. And one of the things he mentioned there was something he called the artifact game. And that was that contactees would often be given an item by the entities that they were supposedly in contact with, that they would really treasure and would think was special and would throw it around to prove that somehow they'd had contact with these things. But these things always turned out to be fairly insignificant. And Keel's point was, if people were actually hoaxing that ETs had given them these things, the Space Brothers had given them these things, surely they would have found something more important than, just a piece of glass or a weird, piece of metal, or in the Joe Simonton case, some pancakes. So what are your thoughts on that, Steve?
Some badly tasting pancakes. And you have the that may be connected to the motif in the fairy faith, excuse me, where there was the one story about the little boy that wanders off, and he encounters a couple of the fairies. Well, he spends some time with them. He has these golden balls they're throwing back and forth and playing with, and when he's going to leave, he thinks they look pretty good. Maybe they're valuable. He wants to take one with him, but of course, you can't get out of fairyland without but taking. So they catch him at the last minute. I mean, there's so many stories like that where people, if they get, whether they're fairy tales or stories or whatever, they get the jewel or the treasure out, and it vanishes or turns into a spider or something like that. I mean, that's common. And it occurs to me, it used to be that Betty and Barney Hill was the case. I thought, okay, John Keel's onto something, transmogrifications of energy and paranormal mimicry and all that. But darn it, Betty and Barney Hill, those were ETs, right? Well, if you look at the strange stuff that happened afterwards, you begin to doubt that. But there's the one incident that I've always thought was fascinating. Betty Hill sees this book supposedly aboard the craft, and it has photographs in it, pictures and writing, and she thought, if nobody believes her, if she can have this book, then at least she knows it happened. So she asked the one she calls the leader, and she says, "Can I take this book?" He says, "Yes." And as she and Barney are about to depart from the spaceship, he comes to her and says, "I'm sorry, the others object. You can't have the book." And she's really upset. But you can't get those treasures out of fairyland or apparently across the threshold of a spaceship. Now, I don't know if there's any real connection there or not, but I've always thought that was interesting. It kind of maybe reflects back to the fairy faith.
Oh, I think you're dead on. I think that in some ways, the artifact game also reflects what you were talking about, that you can't really bring the gold back from fairyland. But I think there's something, and I've mentioned this a number of times, I think there's something just to that general, I suppose, trope or motif within so many fairy tales that you can never bring back the gold or the evidence or anything else from fairyland, just in general with the paranormal. So we never have anything which can prove really that there's Bigfoot. There might be, there's a cast, or there's this kind of smudgy hand mark somewhere, but there's no body. There's no actual ashtray from a flying saucer.
Right.
Even though we might say, well, the government has all of this stuff, but it's the same across the board. That when you think about the way the Fortean world has been divided up between, again, people who hunt ghosts, people who are into UFOs, people who are into cryptids, people who are into all these other different kind of aspects of it, that not one of those yet has laid something on the tables of science which can prove the belief system. And of course, Charles Fort said that's not how it works anyway. You're never going to convince science, because science operates with a master paradigm, and it's difficult to break that paradigm down and then move on to the next thing anyway. But even Fort's position aside, I do think that buried in fairy lore, not even buried, it's there very clearly, there's a very clear allegory for anybody who approaches any of this, whether they're an experiencer or whether there's a researcher, that it seems to be this historical precedent in folklore that you're never going to be able to prove this to the world when you return home.
There's a great story in The Eighth Tower, where John Keel encountered a guy who had been a reporter in West Virginia in the 1920s. And he talks about how they saw this sort of airship go over and seemed like it crashed down in the woods somewhere. Thought it was so weird. It just looked like a fuselage. There were no wings or anything. And so they approach it with the sheriff. There's some tall people there, and then there's some shorter people that he thought might have been Asian or whatever. And there's debris on the ground. They said, don't worry about it. We've got things under control. We'll make a full report to the sheriff later. And so the guy says, Joe, I think his name was, he says he saw this thingamabob on the ground, and for some reason he picked it up as a souvenir and he put it in his pocket. Well, he goes home that night, and about 2 a.m, somebody's knocking on his door, and this guy has kind of one of these wide brim hats, like maybe a World War II uniform. But the guy looked like he might have been a little bit Asian, whatever that means. Not, of course, not Asian, but he said, "You have something that belongs to us." And he thought, he's kind of half asleep. And so he figures out, it's the thingamajig or the thingamabob, whatever he called it. And of course, he retrieves it from his pocket, and more evidence from the space people has evaporated.
It's something else that Keel talks about or mentions that the contactees talk about. And it seems so new agey and so crazy. Whenever anybody talks about things lowering their vibrational density, but Keel mentions it again in Operation Trojan Horse, and he suggests that when the contactees are talking about, well, these things lower, their spiritual density or their energy level or whatever the phrase they use to come into this realm and to interact with us, that might be a more accurate explanation of what's actually happening than a nuts and bolts interpretation of physical craft from another world. Maybe these things do come into our world from elsewhere, the way that some new agey sounding contactees explain these higher energy sources and everything else. Maybe, although that sounds ludicrous, maybe it's actually somehow closer to the truth of the way these things come and go from this existence.
Yes, I agree. But the question is, what are they? Are they real, conscious, separate entities somehow? Or are they something reflective of us? I mean, there's so much of it that is nonsensical. And what I was mentioning before about how this guy came and retrieved the object, Jacques Vallee talks about how the phenomenon negates itself. It's that kind of loop where there's the evidence, it's gone, or it's meaningless.
Right.
Or sometimes the experience is so bizarre, nobody's going to report it, or no one will believe it. So in a sense, or you have a sighting, and men dressed as Air Force officers or in black suits come and say, "Don't talk about your sighting. Give us your photographs," or whatever. So you have that kind of loop of making everything kind of go away and disappear. But yeah, there does seem, well, look, there certainly is at least a paraphysical aspect. A lot of these things leave landing marks. They burn branches. They leave footprints, even though sometimes the footprints appear out of nowhere and then just stop going into nowhere. So there is at least a temporal aspect to some of this. But that's what makes it so hard and so elusive. And then I think I've mentioned before in your show, I've come, it used to be in the old days, back when I was a young man, Dean, I was in the 60s, man. I was an ET guy. I didn't buy the contactee stuff much, but I was fascinated by the Lorenzens books, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. And they were some of the first ones that started writing about close encounters of the third kind before Hynek dubbed the term. And I thought, how cool is that? And then I kind of, I read Keel, Strange Creatures from Time and Space, introduces the Windows idea. Okay, I can handle that. And then I didn't read Trojan Horse for 2 or 3 years because I knew it was going to smash my paradigm. And so, and I still remember a friend of mine and I that we had our high school UFO club, and then later on we had kind of an informal UFO group. But we were kind of bad mouthing Keel, like, what's Keel think he's doing? We might as well just throw up our hands and give up if he's just going to connect everything together. And of course, I read it, and I've joked many times about how I had to go into therapy, and then recovered, and then read Passport to Magonia and went into therapy again. But at that point in time, I had completely shifted. I thought none of it was physical. I thought that it was all I mean, actually said things like we're dealing with psychic manifestations of a collective human subconscious. I mean, I actually said that with a straight face.
You
The
might have been
people
right,
that didn't
though,
want to hear
Steve.
it.
No, I bet they didn't.
I have to tell you a little aside here. I went to the 1976 MUFON Symposium, and Dr. Hynek was speaking there. It was 10 years after the swamp gas fiasco.
Oh, wow.
He had started the Center for UFO Studies. He was one of the good guys. The name of his talk was Swamp Gas Plus 10 and Counting. It was he was very serious, but it was a bit tongue in cheek. He showed some of the cartoons that had come out at that time. And I was from the Church of John Keel. Everybody I was talking to, I'm talking about John Keel and this and that. And they're looking at me like I was an insurance agent at 11 o'clock at night, still talking to them about selling them a policy, and they wanted to go to work the next day. So, but then now I think that some aspects of this, and even Keel, there's a great interview he did with Richard Toronto, who is who you know very well, and has written great books on Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer and the Shaver mystery.
And anybody just quickly who hasn't read War Over Lemuria or Shaverology, the Shaver Mystery Home Companion, should read either or both of those books. He's also got wonderful books on Rock Fogo. Susie Bastille read War Over Lemuria after I guessed it on your show, and she said it was one of the most, I think, I don't want to take her out of context, but she certainly really enjoyed the book. It was a book that she certainly loved reading. And I think Richard Toronto's War Over Lemuria, again, people should get and read. Sorry, go back to where you're at, Steve.
I think Susie blamed you for that. I think she read it in one sitting, just about, and she blamed you for taking.
I was
all that
ranting
time,
about
so,
it. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I love Toronto's books so much.
But in Shavertron, which was the I guess you'd call it a fanzine or whatever he did off and on for several years, he scores an interview with John Keel, and this is like in later years, and it was fascinating. And Keel, you can tell he kind of backtracked a little bit. He seemed, back in the late 60s, he completely rejected the ET idea. But he, like I do, seemed to believe that there's more than one answer to some of these things. And I have to say, I think that in some of this, there may be, when you read through Albert Rosales' database, all those books he's collected, from 01 AD all the way to the present. Some of those things seem very Keelian, for lack of a better word, but there are other things where we may be actually interacting somehow with physical entities from elsewhere, and I don't know where that is. So it seems like we've got this huge mystery of how do we sort through the, in quotes, real, the ethereal, I don't know, and sometimes I wonder, why do we do this? What do we have some kind of desire to punish ourselves? I don't know.
I mean, maybe we do. Let's quickly. What we're talking about, Keel, and we're talking about that when you first became conscious of his ideas, they clearly hadn't become dominant. Maybe they never did. It's ironic, of course, because around that time in 75, he wrote for the Journal of Pop Culture the article that he then would sell as a booklet at various UFO conferences, and that was his subculture of what is it, subculture of flying saucer believers, or whatever it's called. Anyway, it's a great, that's not the exact title, but it's something like that. And he, in that book in 75, or not the booklet, because later the booklet's far more negative, the introduction, but when he wrote that in 75, he thought that his ideas, these, whether we want to call them, whether we're explaining it as ultraterrestrial or interdimensional or somehow connected to our subconscious, that these ideas were becoming dominant because there was him, there was Jacques Vallee, there were Brad Steiger, there were all of these fairly heavy hitters who seemed to be making a real impact on the scene. And the subculture of UFO belief, or again, whatever it's called, tends to end on a positive note that, well, we're getting there. We're leaving away this kind of nuts and bolts, infantile type thinking. When he published the booklet in the 90s, he's kind of like throws up his hands. It's like, it's we never got there. It went worse. But it's funny because I don't think Keel's ideas or Vallee's ideas ever punctured the mainstream of ufology and deflated that balloon as much as Keel hoped they would in 75. But today, when we're kind of on the cusp of as UFO believers, think disclosure, although you and I probably have a very different idea about that. But the people at the forefront of disclosure, whether it's the journalists who have followed it, whether it's like Leslie Keane, who broke the story about the Tic Tacs and the Pentagon secret program in 2017 on the front cover of the New York Times, and hence made it respectable for the media to talk about it, whether it's Tucker Carlson, who's covered it probably more than any other journalist did, who had a mainstream, a highlight, media cable show. He would always talk about UFOs when he was on Fox, or whether it's David Grush himself, the whistleblower, whether it's Tom DeLonge, the head of To the Stars Academy, whether it's Hal Puthoff, one of the board members of To the Stars Academy. All of these people have come out recently within the last few years and have said, this isn't extraterrestrial. This is something else. So it seems, while I doubt a lot of the official voices, my lights are flickering on or off, it's the ultra-terrestrials, the studio lights are going weird. While I doubt a lot of this official narrative, it seems fascinating that somehow, I don't think it's caught on, but when you listen to the movers and shakers of the disclosure movement, it seems like all of them are now saying it's not extraterrestrial. It's something else.
And there's still a lot of diehards that look at the nuts and bolts and the flesh and blood type. I had a year or two ago, some guy friended me on Facebook, so I checked it out, and we had a lot of common friends, and he was into Bigfoot and everything. I thought, it'd be okay. So the first thing he does, he contacts me on Messenger and says, "Are you into woo? WOO, like the weird stuff." And I didn't get it at first. I thought, what do you? So he explained it, and I said, well, if you look at researchers like Ron Moorhead, books by Sally Shepard Wolford, it suggests that there was some strangeness aspects. So he writes, well, thanks, but no thanks. So I thought, okay, well, I will unfriend you first. And I wrote, the truth will become elusive. So I thought, is that ever? But they're still out there. But I have to say, I'm in an area where I just don't know. Keel really opened our eyes. He was a century ahead of everybody easily. But there's, it's interesting when he did that interview with Richard Toronto. He talked about ultraterrestrials. He said he used it as kind of a literary device because he didn't really know for sure what was going on. And he said he borrowed the term from Ivan Sanderson. Now, I'm not sure it gets possible, but I think he might have misspoke. A researcher I know was trying to find a reference anywhere that Sanderson made to ultraterrestrials, although he may not have done it in print. But right. I'm wondering if he was influenced by Meade Lane. Remember him of the Borderland Sciences?
Yeah.
Yes. Very interesting. He was he quoted Meade Lane a lot. Meade Lane was ahead of a lot of people when he was looking at a lot of these things as perhaps not physical metal objects.
Well, of course, Ray Palmer, who in many ways, as John Keel himself said, is the man who invented flying saucers. When you do, as I have obviously recently, with interest in the documentary, go back and read those early amazing stories, as I know your collection is probably as good, if not better than mine. When you read the early fates, when you read the mystics, when you read the searchers, Palmer was clearly saying something very much like what Lane and Keel and Vallee and everybody who came after was saying. He, of course, thought that perhaps these things were related to the New Age Bible Owaspi, who I know Susie Bastille knows an awful lot about, and we talked about that in the last week's show, that these things were coming from this kind of dimension above us, and they were interacting with us, and they always had. So there have been people from the beginning of modern flying saucer belief who have presented alternative ways of looking at it, and probably Meade Lane and Raymond Palmer and Jacques Vallee and John Keel are probably some of the most significant people. Now I'm going to throw you under the bus a little bit here, Steve. What do you think about Vallee's Trinity, the Best Kept Secret?
I haven't read it yet.
Okay.
I've heard some negative things about it. I don't, I guess I can't really comment on it since I haven't read it. Vallee has always thought that there was a physical aspect to this, And as an aside, maybe I told you this on another show. I actually talked to Jacques Vallee in about 1990 on the radio once, and I completely forgot about it. I found a cassette when I was moving to Point Pleasant,
Wow.
marked save. And I thought, and usually I'm very, very meticulous about whether it be political, UFO, whatever. And so I popped in a cassette player, and it was a show. I was at work in Wyandotte, Michigan, and I was I punched the tape recorder. I guess I knew Jacques Vallee was going to be on. He was talking about Revelations, which was the third part of that trilogy
It's a
he
great
wrote
book.
in that time period. Yes.
That's my favorite
And-
book of his after Messengers of Deception, actually. It's a fantastic book.
Excellent book. And this Mark Scott was a political guy, wasn't normally into this, but he did a pretty good interview. He was always interested in what people believed. And so I'm listening to this, and they had this opening, and then the first caller, I completely forgot about this. The first caller said, "Steve from Wyandotte, you're on WXYT," and it was me. The first thing I'm doing is praising Jacques Vallee, being a real suck up about his books. And I said he was a breath of fresh air, and Jacques Vallee said, "I agree." So we had a brief conversation, and then there were two other callers that were excellent. One person said he saw something that looked like it came through a dimension or an opening or whatever. And the other woman said that a group of them saw something and then years ago and then never talked about it, like that amnesia thing that comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day she brought it up and everybody remembered it, but for some reason they all went home and for years didn't talk about it. Anyway, I'm glad I've preserved it on CD. I'll have to send you a copy sometime.
I would love to.
I thought, man, I can't, it came back to me. But of course, I guess after 3 decades, I could be forgiven for not remembering.
Well, that's understandable. We had a question, and I don't know if I can find them. I think I blue marked them. Oh, yes, both Vincent Richardson and Susie Bastille, who then jokingly said she also wants to know when your dishes will be done. But they both want to know when your book's going to be done, Steve.
The dishes will probably be done a little earlier. I tell people by the end of the decade. I have parts of it written. I guess I don't have the, I don't know if I want to call it the MacGuffin or whatever, the thing that's going to just pull it all together. It will be about patterns, connections, parallels in the paranormal from throughout history, throughout different parts of the world, and in seemingly different aspects of the paranormal, like cryptids, psychic phenomena, UFOs. So I've got part of it written, so it's not a fantasy or a pipe dream, but I don't have no idea when it'll be ready for publishing.
Oh, it's an agonizing process. I've tried to turn my PhD dissertation into a more accessible book, and it's something I was doing for a number of years before I moved into the documentary. So now it's now on total hold. But yeah, I understand how long it can take to get something which you are happy for to hit print. But where do people actually, like, if they want to see what you're up to now, or they want to listen to your podcast and things like that, where should they go?
Well, I do a podcast, The High Strangeness Factor, on the Paranormal UK radio network. My regular co-host is Andy Mercer from across the ocean, and he's my producer too. So if he doesn't produce the show, the only person that hears it is me talking to myself. And you were on just recently, and Susie Bastille was on recently. We just hit 5 years with a hiatus or two in there.
Congratulations.
So there's quite a backlog of fascinating people that I've been able to talk to. And also, I don't have a website, but you can contact me on Facebook. Just type in Steve Ward. I think if you type in Point Pleasant, you'll find me. So, and whatever I'm doing is I post a lot of stuff. I'm working at the Mothman Museum, at least on weekends, greeting people and answering questions. And I will guide people out to or follow them out to the Mothman statue, which is right next door. And I'm there so that if they want the whole family to get their picture taken, they don't have to send the kid out they don't like or the black sheep of the family to take the picture. I can get them all.
I always see on your Facebook lots of cool photos, and we had this reminds me, we had a question. early on I put on screen. Let me see if I blue marked it before we go, because I think I may have put a little icon next to it so I can remember to go back. And we did, from Bob Antone, who is a good friend of the show. He asked, Steve, tell us about putting money in the Mothman's Heine tradition.
Well, the secret is exposed now, if you forgive the pun. The Mothman, if you walk around, and I always show people, I don't want them to go home without the full Monty, so to speak. So I do escort them around to the Shiny Heine. People do horrible things back there. I can't repeat out loud, being a family show, but people will stick quarters back there. You can imagine where they stick them. And so I've been telling people, pay no attention to the quarters. It goes into my retirement fund.
Well, I hope so, Steve, because you are one of the great gentlemen and one of the most fantastic treasures that we have in the Fortean world. And also, quite frankly, one of the clearest thinkers and one of the few people that I actually agree with, which doesn't mean I'm not interested in other perspectives, because I most certainly am, but it's always nice to chat to somebody that that you can share some commonalities with. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Steve. It was a great joy to talk with you, like it always is.
Well, my pleasure, Dean. It's always a pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you, mate. And until I talk to you again, Steve, and until I chat to everybody else out there, keep it weird.